Would you like to get paid to fly, either as a fun side job or as a way to reach the 1,500 hours required for an ATP? Becoming a CFI is a popular way to build flight time, but it's not for everyone. So today, Rob Mark, who's held many of aviation's odd jobs, is here to tell us about 13 ways you can build flight time in part 2 of this 2-episode series. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation. My name is Max Trescott. I've been flying for 50 years. I'm the author of several books and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year. And my mission is to help you become the safest possible pilot. Last week in part 1, we talked about ways to build flight time, working in part 135 charter, part 135 cargo, flying skydivers, pipeline patrol, working as a ferry pilot, and working as an aerial survey pilot. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/323. And if you're new to this show, welcome. Great to have you here. Now, if you would take a moment right now and on your phone, go ahead and touch either the subscribe key or if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And let me remind you that this is a listener-supported show supported by people, just like you. And we have several new ways that you can show your love and support for the show. Just go out to our new support page at aviationnewstalk.com/support, where you'll find links to support the show via PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. And when you make a donation, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up in the news for the week of April 15th, 2024, GAMI says it has 1 million gallons of G100 UL. A charter group calls for cockpit voice recorders on all aircraft. And if you've ever thought airline travel is going to the dogs, well, you may be right, and we'll tell you why. All this and more, and the news starts now. From FlyingMag.com, GAMI says it has 1 million gallons of G100 UL fuel. General Aviation Modification, Inc., or GAMI, CEO George Brawley said that the VTOL, a commodities trading company, has brewed 1 million gallons of GAMI's G100 UL 100-octane unleaded aviation fuel stored in a tank in its Louisiana plant. More importantly, after testing the fuel, it received a certificate of authenticity, which then makes it commercially available. With the announcement, Brawley and GAMI hope to counter critics that say while the fuel has received FAA approval for use under the STC process, it's not commercially available. The term is important because of a consent decree taken in California that could force the changeover to an unleaded fuel when an alternative to 100 low lead becomes commercially available. From avweb.com, Charter Group calls for cockpit voice recorders on all aircraft. The Air Charter Safety Foundation is urging all aircraft manufacturers to install cockpit voice recorders on all new aircraft. Yes, and they mean all aircraft, including the ones you and I fly under Part 91, and is calling for an affordable alternative for legacy aircraft and those not covered by current and future regulations. In a news release, the ACSF said it would like to see manufacturers come up with a standardized CVR system so economies of scale would bring the price down. Meanwhile, for those aircraft that won't be captured by a mandate, it's saying that off-the-shelf systems, like the Aparo Vision 1000, can provide a lot of data without the huge cost of certifying a system. The NTSB said, quote, "A cost-effective solution is necessary for greater usage across many fleet types. Although this solution may not be certified, many systems have demonstrated some level of existing crash survivability with options for hardened recorder options." The NTSB has been calling for mandatory equipage of all commercial aircraft with recorders to provide speedy and comprehensive access to data in crash investigations. From globalair.com, NTSB warns of aluminum prop blade fractures without proper inspections and maintenance. The NTSB issued a safety alert to operators and pilots, stressing the need for proper inspections and maintenance to prevent fractures on aluminum propeller blades. Aluminum blades are susceptible to fatigue cracking and can fracture if a small nick or corrosion on the surface or edge is not found and fixed during the pre-flight inspection or maintenance. Damage like this can concentrate stress from normal aircraft operation loads and lead to fatigue cracking and propeller blade fracture. Fatigue cracking and fracture of the prop blade can result in airframe and engine damage and possible loss of control. Planes used for aerial applications and coastal operations are at a higher risk for propeller damage due to more frequent exposure to chemicals or salt-laden moisture, causing corrosion that leads to a propeller blade fracturing due to fatigue cracking. Planes flying from unimproved or backcountry airstrips are also at higher risk for prop blade damage due to the loose rocks, gravel, or debris that can cause small nicks in the prop that turn into fatigue cracks. Without regular inspections and proper adherence to manufacturer-recommended overhaul schedules, aluminum propeller blades can have undetected fatigue cracks and blade separation, which can have catastrophic consequences. The NTSB has investigated numerous crashes in which a failure to properly inspect and repair damage to aluminum props resulted in fatigue cracking and fractures. The NTSB recommends that owners, operators, and pilots inspect all areas of the propeller blade for damage, like nicks or corrosion, during the pre-flight inspection, including the back face side of the blade, paying particular attention to the leading edge. Any findings should be referred to a qualified mechanic for inspection and repair before further flight. And from the NTSB.gov, the final report is out on one of the most unusual crashes that I've read about. On October 29, 2022, about 2:52 p.m., an experimental amateur-built Bearhawk patrol airplane, November 964 Romeo Sierra, was substantially damaged when it was involved in an accident near Hanover Township, Pennsylvania. Before the flight, the pilot told a friend that the airplane had a rigging issue that seemed to cause the airplane to kick laterally during turns. His friend performed a 10-minute flight and reported that he noticed the odd yawing moment while performing turns. The pilot responded that he would address the issue at a later time. After fueling the airplane, the pilot and pilot-rated passenger fastened their seatbelts and departed the airport. Flight track information indicated that several minutes after departure, the aircraft leveled off. Soon after, witnesses reported that the airplane rolled, then bucked as its nose dipped down initially, then pitched up quickly. Several witnesses reported seeing the pilot outside of the airplane at this time, and one reported the pilot impact and then spiral off the airplane's tail. Witnesses then observed the pilot and airplane descend to the ground. The airplane impacted terrain at a near vertical, nose-down attitude. That the pilot was observed to have buckled his seatbelt and shoulder harness before flight, and that his seatbelt and shoulder harness were found intact, unlatched, and undamaged, suggests that he intentionally unbuckled his seatbelt during the short flight. Given his concern about the yaw during turns, he may have been attempting to observe the problem with the tail. It's possible that either the pilot fell out of the airplane while attempting to observe the tail section, or that the pilot displaced a flight control while attempting to observe the tail, which then caused an abrupt pitching moment that ejected him from the airplane. Although the reason for the pilot's exit from the airplane during flight could not be determined, his impact with the tail section of the airplane during flight resulted in substantial damage to the tail section and a subsequent loss of control during flight, from which the pilot-rated passenger would not have been able to recover. The pilot was a 76-year-old male with an ATP and approximately 21,000 hours of total time. Toxicology testing detected the antidepressant citalopram in the pilot's heart, blood, and urine. While it's unknown for how long the pilot was on this medication or the severity of his depression, witnesses reported that the pilot was functioning well and looked forward to participating in a holiday airport event. The FAA will consider a special issuance of a medical certificate for depression after 6 months of treatment if the applicant is clinically stable and using only one approved treatment medication. However, the accident pilot had not applied for a special issuance. Probable cause: the pilot's decision to unlatch his seatbelt during flight, which allowed him to exit the airplane and impact the tail, resulting in a loss of control and impact with terrain. In other news from LAMag.com, a pilot and their dog survived a ditching in the ocean waters off the Southern California coast on Sunday afternoon after a Piper Saratoga experienced an engine failure. An air rescue team from the LA County Sheriff's Department swiftly mobilized to help the pair, but the pilot and their loyal dog managed to swim ashore, where they were met by deputies from the LA County Sheriff's Department. From globalair.com, Cirrus is aiming to make aircraft ownership easier with its new aircraft management service, Cirrus One. The program will provide complete aircraft management such as hangar storage, pilot service, and aircraft maintenance. The new program is available at Cirrus's Orlando, Dallas, and Phoenix locations. From avweb.com, after a year of negotiation, NetJet pilots have overwhelmingly agreed to a revised contract. NetJet's Association of Shared Airline Pilots claimed the new agreement would align pilot pay with industry standards seen at major airlines. Under the new agreement, pilots are set to receive a 52% increase in compensation over the next 5 years, with base pay ranging from $86,000 to more than $400,000 per year. And finally, from usatoday.com, the world's first doggy jet service. Dogs will soon be able to experience their own first-class flight with the launch of the world's first jet charter company specifically designed for man's best friend. Bark, the dog toy company that coordinates the popular treat subscription BarkBox, is partnering with a jet charter service to take away the challenges of long-distance traveling with dogs. Bark Air, as the company calls it, offers the white glove experience typical of a human's first-class experience and redirected all that pampering to pooches. Taking dogs in airplanes is typically a stressful endeavor, with different airlines having different policies for pet travel. For example, American Airlines allows small dogs in a carrier to be placed under the seat in front, but larger dogs are put in the cargo space, which has been found to be stressful for pets. By contrast, Bark Air uses a jet charter service. Now, I looked at their website, and under the FAQ it says, "Am I allowed to bring a human with me?" And their answer is, while Bark Air is an airline for dogs, we recognize that you might want to bring your human with you. After all, you need scratches. So each dog ticket comes with a pass for one human. Additional passes are available for purchase. And it's a good thing that one human can come along, because that fare is not cheap, especially if it were for just the dog. The first Bark Air flights will take off May 23rd, and so far there are only 2 flight routes available, both from New York's Westchester County Airport. From New York to London's Stansted Airport, it'll cost $8,000 one way, and to LA's Van Nuys Airport will cost $6,000 one way, which to me actually sounds very cheap for a jet charter from coast to coast, so maybe you'll want to bring a dog along to get a cheap charter ticket. Bark Air passengers can skip TSA checkpoints and screenings and instead experience a simple check-in process where they can meet the other dogs on the flight, and the humans are served a meal cooked by on-site chefs. When boarding, a Bark Air concierge is on hand to ensure the dogs are socializing and adjusting to the environment well. Each flight will undergo Dogs Fly First flight prep that includes calming pheromones, music, and colors that pups prefer. How they know that, I don't know. To make the flying experience easier and more enjoyable, dogs have access to various aids such as calming treats, noise-canceling earmuffs, and calming jackets. During takeoff and descent, dogs are given a beverage of their choice to help their ears adjust to cabin pressurization. Of course, there will be plenty of treats on the flight. And no, this article did not come out on April 1st. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk with Rob Mark on part 2 of 13 Ways to Build Flight Hours. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's get to the good news. First, congratulations to Robert Shapiro. He writes, "I just donated to your show to celebrate passing my check ride last night. I earned my Boeing 737 type rating at my forever airline." That's kind of cute. Southwest Airlines. I didn't even know that Robert had joined Southwest. Congratulations on that as well. You may recall that we had Robert on the show last year in episode 290 when he talked about adding a gyroplane rating for fun. Robert, congratulations. Now, I get all kinds of feedback from you, for which I greatly thank you. I really do appreciate it when you take the time to contact me. And trust me that I do read or listen to everything that you send. And I'm sorry that we don't have the time to read them all or play them all here on the show. Now, this one came in as a voicemail on my phone over the weekend, and it was interesting to say the least. This is about last week's episode 323. Here it is, and listen and see what you think about it.
Hello. I just listened to that incredible episode of you and that guy Rob talking about how to build time for new pilots, and I'm gonna be a pilot someday, and I just wanted to tell you how helpful I thought that episode was, and please keep more of them coming.
Now, did that voice sound at all familiar to you? Here's the story behind it. Someone called me over the weekend and they reached my voicemail. And since they weren't able to reach me, they spontaneously came up with what you just heard. And that person, if you haven't guessed it already, is Rob Mark, who of course was our guest last week and again this week. He is certainly the king of silly voices. And I just hope that you too have a good friend in your life like Rob, who's occasionally silly and makes you laugh. Thank you, Rob. You brightened up my day as you always do. And here's a note from yahoo.com. It says, this job can pay $100K per year with no degree. Actually, it's more than that. And 1,800 spots are available. Hiring opens for 4 days. The FAA is hiring thousands of air traffic controllers in 2024 to fill needs across the U.S. Controllers work in airport towers and radar rooms to navigate planes through traffic and weather and make sure that passengers get to their destination. And it can pay off for those who get hired. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says the median, that would be the middle wage for controllers, is $137,000, so half of them make more than that. FAA Administrator Mike Whitaker, who we've had here on the show, said in a news release, quote, "We are encouraging anyone interested in a new challenge and a rewarding safety career to explore this opportunity." The hiring period opens from April 19th through the 22nd, so that's coming up real quickly. So jump on this if you're interested. According to the FAA, applicants need to be a U.S. citizen, be able to speak English clearly, be younger than 31 years old before the closing date of the application period, have either 3 years of general work experience or 4 years of education leading to a bachelor's degree or a combination of both, pass a medical examination, security investigation, and FAA air traffic pre-employment test. So if you're interested, head on out to faa.gov/BE-ATC. Of course, I'll include a link to that in our show notes. And speaking of the FAA, you may be familiar with their flight deck video series that provides pilots with actual runway approach and airport taxiway footage captured with aircraft-mounted cameras, combined with diagrams and visual graphics to clearly identify hotspots and other safety-sensitive items. Now, to supplement these videos, the FAA recently began publishing additional Pilot Handbook content. And they say this content includes details such as airport-specific cautions, information local controllers want pilots to know, airport communications, airspace details, and other pre-flight planning resources. The supplemental content is currently available for 55 airports across the NAS, with more content in development. There's actually a map, and I'll give you a link to it in a moment, where you can go online to find which airports have pilot handbooks. Now, these are all distributed through ForeFlight, and I first noticed them when updating my charts in ForeFlight. And under the Downloads tab, I noticed new downloads such as California, FAA Pilot Handbooks. And then to find that data for a particular airport in ForeFlight, put in the airport name. So, for example, KLVK for Livermore, California. And then on the airport information page in ForeFlight, touch the Procedure tab, the Airport tab, and then in the list of diagrams for the airport, you'll find one that's labeled Pilot Handbook. Now, the one for Livermore is 4 pages long and contains information including the phone number for the tower, a lot of details on runway and taxiways. For example, one note says, there have been attempted landings on taxiway Alpha from Wither, and I think they mean either, that's a typo, from either runway 7 left or runway 25 right. There's also a page of cautions, including hotspots where pilots are easily confused on the airport, and other cautions. Page 3 has information on communications. For example, under traffic patterns, it says, remember there are no standard patterns at controlled airports when the tower is in operation. Pilots will follow tower directions. And page 4 has some additional information about bird activity and noise-sensitive areas near the airport. Now, I mentioned that there's a map online that you can go to find out if there's a pilot handbook available for a particular airport. Just go out to faa.gov/flight_deck to see if the airport has a flight deck video or a pilot handbook. And I'll include a link to that in the show notes. And by the way, here is a suggestion for the FAA. The name Pilot Handbook is misleading. The FAA already has a whole series of pilot handbooks, things like the Airplane Flying Handbook and the Instrument Flying Handbook. And these new things are not at all like those existing pilot handbooks, so I suggest you rename them Airport Handbooks, which is what they are about. Now, over the weekend, I flew southwest into Burbank so that I could fly with one of my VisionJet clients in Southern California. I do sometimes fly various places around the country to fly with clients. Now, he was headed out this week to Knoxville to do his annual recurrent training, and he wanted to do some brush-up work before going back for that training, which, by the way, if you fly VisionJet and want to do that with me, please contact me, as I'd be happy to help. Anyway, when we landed in Burbank, the 737 I was on braked extremely hard as we landed. I was in the front row, and I actually put my foot on the wall in front of me to brace myself. And I wondered if perhaps that was the auto brake in use. Now, you may recall we talked about the 737 AutoBrak last week in regard to United Flight 2477 in Houston. So as I was getting off the plane, I popped my head into the cockpit and asked the pilots if they had used the AutoBrak, and if so, was it on a 3 or a max setting? And they said, yes, it was on the max setting, and they told me that their company policy is that whenever the runway is wet, they are required to land using the AutoBrak with a setting at max. They also said it didn't matter what the braking reports were for a particular runway. If it was wet, they had to use the max AutoBrak. Now, of course, Burbank has a somewhat short runway. You may recall that in 2000, a Southwest jet went off the end of the runway, and there was a classic photo of it sitting right next to a Chevron gas station sign. Now, fortunately, there were no fatalities, though there were 44 injuries. The NTSB concluded that the probable cause for that accident was excessive flight speed and the steep angle of the glide path, which was 7 degrees as opposed to the normal 3 degrees, and the flight crew's failure to abort the approach when conditions were not met for a stable approach and landing. The action of the flight controller was listed as a contributing factor in the accident, where they said, quote, contributing to the accident was the controller's positioning of the aircraft in such a manner as to leave no safe options for the flight crew other than a go-around maneuver. And that gas station, which was narrowly missed by the aircraft, was later closed and demolished due to safety concerns. That lot has now become a dedicated green space. In a moment, we'll talk with Rob Mark about another half dozen jobs that pilots can use to build time, but first I wanted to ask for your help. This is a listener-supported show, and it's really the support from people just like you that let me take time off from teaching, which is my main job, to spend time researching and producing this show for you. And as I've mentioned before, we lose every month probably at least a half dozen supporters because their credit cards expire and they don't take the time to update the cards. So we're constantly in need of new people who haven't supported the show in the past, just to stay even and offset the people we lose each month when their credit cards expire. So I'd like to invite you to join the club and become part of the community that makes this all possible. And that's easy to do. If you're working out right now or running, hey, just stop that, take a rest, go pull out your phone and go to aviationnewstalk.com/support. And there you'll find 4 different ways that you can donate to support the show. And when you're thinking about what to donate, well, think about what you might pay for an hour of flight instruction or maybe an hour of aircraft rental. And of course, aviation is a very small community, so see if you know any of these people. 2 people signed up to support the show via Patreon, thanks to Mango Mike and to Tim Loy. We also had a donation via Venmo, and that was Bobby Strawn, and a donation from Zelle, Stephen Bell. In fact, this is the second time that Stephen has donated in the past month. Thank you very much. And on PayPal, we had a one-time donation from Robert Shapiro. And my thanks to David Hassano, who signed up to make a monthly contribution via PayPal. Thanks so much to everyone who helps support the show. Coming up next, we'll be talking with Rob Mark about jobs that you can find to help build ours. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Rob Mark. He's the former senior editor of Flying Magazine, and he's also worked as an air traffic controller, an airline pilot, corporate pilot, and CFI. Rob publishes the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com, and you can find his writing in numerous publications, including AOPA Pilot and in the pages of Business and Commercial Aviation magazine, part of the Aviation Week group. And now here's our conversation with Rob Mark. Well, let's switch gears now and talk about Part 91, which includes corporate flying, or really flying for anyone who owns an airplane and needs you to do something for them. I know you've done some of that in the past, Rob. Tell us about it. How did you get into it?
When I was a controller in Chicago, the airport that I was based at was a Palwaukee, Chicago executive now, but it was a friendly little place. Everybody kind of knew everybody, and I had the advantage of being able to walk around and meet people on the airport, and they'd say, "Who are you?" And I'd say, "Oh, I'm a controller from the tower." And they go, "Oh, yeah, okay." Well, anyway, and as I came to meet people, one thing leads to another, and after a while, they'd ask you if you want to go flying, and or what your certificates were. And I said, "Well, in this case, I had recently obtained my commercial and my instrument and my multi, and I don't know, maybe I had 400 hours or something like that." And this one guy said to me, "Well, I own a Seneca." He said, "You want to see it?" I said, "Sure." And he took me over to the hangar and we looked at it. And I said, "Wow, that's really neat." He said, "Well, we'll go for a ride sometime." And a couple of weeks later, he invited me to go with him. And he said, "You want to fly?" And I said, "Sure." And then I flew it a couple of times with him. And he said, "Hey, listen, do you kind of have, time in between work and all that, where you're not working that are weekdays?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Would you like to do some flying for me?" And I said, "Well, like what?" He said, "Well, I need to get these parts from our factory here in, the north side of Chicago over to Detroit." I said, "Sure." But because at first I thought, well, who's going to fly with me? He said, "No, we'll get you an instructor and we'll get you checked out in the airplane so you're comfy and you can do it yourself." And I said, "Oh, okay." Because I was so stunned that somebody that I thought really didn't know me that well was going to let me have his airplane to use to go fly across the lake and over to Michigan. And I think I probably, over maybe about an 18-month period till he sold the airplane, I'll bet I got 150 hours of multi-engine time. And all I ever had before that was the 20 something I earned getting my multi, and that was in a 310 at Palwaukee. But so, I mean, that was great to me. And then that led to another 91 job in a Piper Navajo Chieftain with a fellow that worked for he was a broker in the meatpacking industry. And of course, up in this edge of the world, the meatpacking industry is kind of situated in Nebraska and South Dakota and that sort of thing. And so I often ended up taking the Chieftain over west, an hour and a half to Sioux City, Iowa, or Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or things like that. And I almost never had to stay overnight. It was always just drop some people off and go back home, and maybe you might go back and get them a day later. And I said, "Sure," because it was all more multi-engine time. And again, maybe people were a little freer with their airplanes then than they are now, or maybe I had a really honest face. I don't know which it was. But, so again, those opportunities just came because I walked around the airport and met people, and I had that little card with my name and phone number on it, and they could find me. But later on, after Midway Airlines shut down, which was, of course, scheduled Part 135, I went back into the 91 world, and I started flying in the right seat of a Citation 2 out of Midway. And I know we talked about that a little earlier, and that was just to kind of get back into the swing of things because I hadn't flown a Part 91 airplane in quite a while. But the one nice thing about 91 is that you never really know where you're going to go or when you're going to go or what you're going to carry. And the whole flight is on you, from pre-flighting the airplane, making sure the airplane logs are current. So you need to know what makes an airplane current, the aircraft and the avionics and the instruments, and down to, has this thing had a pitot-static check in the last 24 months, and checking the weather, running a weight and balance to make sure that you were not out of balance, checking the fuel, being sure you had enough capacity to carry the number of people that they wanted to put. And the Chieftain could hold 246, I think could put 8 people in the back and 2 people in front. But of course, you couldn't carry full fuel with that, even though it was 350 horse motors on each side. So it was all a lot of brain work, which as a young pilot to me was really interesting because I didn't have a whole lot of practice with that anyway, other than what I had done for my certificate rides. So this was the practical side of it. So whenever opportunities like that came along, I always jumped on them. And then later, after the Midway part-time job went away, I ended up at the charter outfit for a number of years doing 135. And then I heard that somebody had a citation job at another airport that was a 650 citation, which was the swept wing citation. But this would be a corporate job, like a real job in a real world for a company that It was a media company, actually, and they wanted a co-captain. Well, I wasn't typed in the airplane, but when they interviewed me, I guess I must have had all my I's dotted and T's crossed because they said, "So, do you want the job?" I said, "Yeah, sure." Um, and next thing I know is a week later, I was scheduled to go to flight safety down in Wichita, and they put me through Citation 3 initial, and I got typed in the Citation in that particular model of Citation. And it was a real fun experience because, of course, people that may not be familiar with training in aviation, you kind of get this fire hose effect where they just try to jam so much information into your brain in a 2 week period that your mind is just ugh, your eyes are just boggled. And but I got through it, and the best part is when we took the ride, the guy said, "Oh, by the way, I've got to renew my DPE certificate to issue type ratings." This was the guy from flight service. "So we're going to have an FAA inspector on board in the simulator that's going to look over your shoulder." I said, "Oh, great." So, and I thought, "Oh God, please let me remember all this stuff and the numbers and the pressures." And he sat through the oral, and we got out, and he said, "You seem to know your stuff." And I said, "Thank you." I thought, "Oh, yes," because I was never really sure. And when you're a young pilot, you're never really sure that you have enough in your brain. But then we went out and did the ride, and it was just like the training. And I went home, 2 weeks later, and started flying this 650 Citation. And we took it everywhere from the East Coast down to the Caribbean, out to I know we did LA a few times, and in fact, the first time we went into LA, another training opportunity. It was not like now where everything's a GPS arrival or GPS based arrival. We had a star, a standard terminal arrival procedure, except that each fix said, cross, I don't know, 100, east of LAX at 230, and cross 80 east at 18,000, and cross. But we had to keep dialing that stuff in order to make the points. And then we had to figure out in our head, let's see, how fast do I have to come down in order to make that crossing restriction? And I'm flying at 6 miles a minute, no, 7 miles. And wait, no, there's a wind behind me. So the ground speed's actually, but I've got to come down. And we did all that stuff in our head. And it was kind of funny because by the time we got to LA, my brain, in fact, the first time I did it in the left seat, my brain was dead, because if I had not had a guy in the right seat that was keeping up with me, I could never have done it. So thank God arrival procedures are a little easier now for people that are flying single pilot in a fast turbine airplane, because in the old days, you'd have never kept up. But again, it was great experience. And then that job, like many jobs, it just went away, and the company was sold, and I ended up flying a Hawker 800, same kind of deal. And it was for a major corporation based in the area, and we flew that airplane all over the place as well. Again, different kind of airplane, different systems, different airports. So I've got multi-engine time building. I've got multi-engine turbine time building. I've got multi-engine turbine PIC time building, and just kind of goes on and on and on. And that's how I got from, flying that Seneca, often VFR across Lake Michigan with 400 hours or something, to each job is a stepping stone. But of course, 91 means it can be anything. You can go anywhere at any time of the day or night, and there are really no restrictions on you other than the certification requirements of the aircraft itself, or on you as a pilot. But and again, some people like that because they never know where they're going. And a version of that now is Part 91K, which are the fractionals. They are 91 technically, and they're flying some big, fast airplanes. That's the executive jet and some of the other ones that are very prolific. I mean, where people own a piece of an airplane. And so you might never have the same passengers on board before the fifth flight, and it just keeps rotating. But then they operate as a kind of a hybrid because most of them operate to Part 135 standards, even though they're flying the aircraft under Part 91. So then there's a blend of, so having that 135 experience helped blend into a 91K operation. And the only thing I forgot to mention about 135 flying is that when I did it, it was so long ago, we didn't have cell phones that we depended on. We depended on pagers. And the pager was what rousted you from your desk whenever they needed you. And when the pager went off, it was often at 2 o'clock in the morning. And they'd say, well, we need to depart Waukegan at 4:30. So, basically get your butt dressed and get to the airport and pre-flight it. And you're going to Atlanta, and okay, and you're half asleep on the road. And but again, that was just the way it worked. And again, there are people that don't like that. They want that. They want to know. They want a guarantee of I'm going to be off this number of days on these days. Then what? You need an airline job. Although the 91Ks are getting better at that. And some of the charters are getting better at that. But if you don't like flexibility, you don't want to be a Part 91 pilot because, again, it does change. It's based on the needs of the company, not on a particular schedule.
Yeah, I think what you're highlighting here is just the wide variety and kind of variability in the Part 91 world. I think for folks who have low time and are looking to get their foot in, they'll probably be looking for piston jobs, just like that first piston job you talked about with the Seneca. I'm thinking of some local Part 91 jobs that I have heard of. I remember one lady who was a CFI, and she got tied in with the owner of a turbine Bonanza. And for whatever reason, he just wanted somebody to fly that airplane and take him around wherever he wanted to go. And I've heard of those kinds of things multiple times. So you may find someone, for example, who is older and they're just no longer interested in flying themselves around, but they need somebody to fly them. In fact, I remember a similar story with a P210 locally, and somebody was flying that gentleman around all the time. We've got, if you step up just a little bit, a local maintenance facility manages a couple of Part 91 aircraft. One's a King Air, and I know that they're often looking for people in the right seat. And to be in the right seat, all you're going to need is your commercial certificate and multi-engine rating. They probably don't necessarily need a whole lot of hours to bring you along for that. They've also got a Piaggio. They're probably looking for more experience. And then in terms of companies, certainly here in Silicon Valley, lots of our tech companies have flight departments. When I was at Hewlett-Packard, they had a flight department and still do. The low end was a Twin Otter that they would run back and forth between here and, let's see, the Lincoln Airport, because HP has a facility at Roseville. And so they just ran back and forth. I think it was 6 times a day, taking employees back and forth on that route. And so that's actually a way that someone could enter in at the kind of the low end of a flight department. And maybe they'd work their way up over time to flying the Gulfstream 650s that they have there. So the larger the flight department, you may actually find that there are a variety of different opportunities within that department, and you might be able to start at the bottom and work your way up. Let's see, anything else you want to mention about Part 91?
Well, and that's true because there are departments that operate sometimes a high-performance single-engine aircraft to use for very short runs, and the other aircraft might all be turbine jets. And how do you find those? You have to do some research. We didn't have the internet 20 years ago to speed the research. We had to make phone calls and ask for favors and whatever. But there are sources of information around, but it takes time. It takes work. That's just what somebody has to do.
All right, so let's move on and let's talk about being an air tour pilot. And now there are a lot of ways you can do that. Part of it is that you may find yourself limited to doing this in large cities or tourist areas or things like that. On the other hand, this is one of those things that you can do on your own with just a commercial pilot certificate, as long as you keep your tours within 25 miles of your departure airport. However, under 91.147, you will have to apply for and receive an LOA from the FAA and show proof of registration in an FAA-approved anti-drug and alcohol misuse prevention program. So, for example, I know a CFI locally who flies out of San Carlos, which is within 25 miles of San Francisco, and they've got a website offering bay tours, and the public can sign up for a flight in, for example, a 172 or something like that, and get a chance to see the city from the air. So that's something that someone could do with relatively low time if they're entrepreneurial and want to go ahead and set up a way to get business. If I think about it, my very first exposure to aviation was on just that kind of thing. The one pilot who did everything at the Grand Canyon Airport in Wellsboro, Pennsylvania, where I learned to fly, he would do tours of the town. And I still remember, this goes back into the late 60s or early 70s, there was a sign at the airport that said, tours, $5 a person. So, I remember Mom and my sister and me, we were all in the 172. And boy, that just really turned me on. It was a great chance to spend 20 minutes up in the air and see what the world looked like from up there. As I think about tours, probably one of the huge centers for tours is going to be Grand Canyon tours, flying out of Boulder City, flying out of, for example, Las Vegas McCarran Airport. And some of these flights are going to be in twins, and they are looking for people to start in the right seat and eventually move over to the left seat. I did take a tour myself, a Grand Canyon tour in a caravan. And so I've recently found a company that is hiring people to fly the Cessna to a caravan with a minimum of just 250 hours. So that's an opportunity to get in the air with relatively low time and start making money and earning your way giving these tours. Some of the other areas where you might do this would be tourist areas. So, for example, Hawaii. If you're interested in moving to Hawaii or you happen to live in Hawaii, there are all kinds of tours that go on over there. A lot of them are helicopters, so you might need to be a helicopter pilot to do that, to build time. Likewise, Alaska. A lot of tours Alaska. You see a lot of float planes up there. So again, this is an opportunity for someone to sign on and build some time and experience giving those tours. It's probably going to be fairly seasonal. In Alaska, I would expect that most of that flying happens in 3 months over the summertime. A lot less flying happens in the wintertime. But I've also known of people who move. They'll be doing Alaska work in the summertime and Hawaii work in the wintertime. We have a little company here in the San Francisco area called Seaplane Adventures. It's located just north of the city, and they give tours of the city. One of my helicopter instructors, actually 2 of them now, have moved to New York, where they needed about 1,000 hours before they could hire on and start giving tours in helicopters in New York. So lots of opportunities for air tour pilots. And of course, it's one of the few areas where you can actually start up your own operation. You don't necessarily need to get hired on by somebody else.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned entrepreneurial, and I think that pilots that look at a career in aviation with kind of an entrepreneurial slant will find what they're looking for. Because rather than sit there and say, well, I've applied to 3 different airlines and now I'm going to sit here and wait for them to call me. I think when you're entrepreneurial, you're thinking, gee, I want a better life. I want to be able to fly this kind of airplane. I'd like to make a little more money. Maybe I don't mind traveling. I like traveling. I would move. I'd go to, the Grand Canyon out in Arizona. I could live out there for a while. And so again, maybe it's not going to be your entire career, but you know that maybe some of the experience that you gain out there will really scoot you along to the next job. And a career outside of the airlines isn't necessarily a straight line. You may have to move a little bit. And again, I think that that mindset of thinking for yourself and trying to imagine your life differently than it is now. In fact, one place we forgot to mention when I was talking about 135, someplace I always thought would be really cool was flying seaplanes out of the Northwest, maybe out of the Kenmore Air out in Seattle and Vancouver, and there's Tropic Air down in Fort Lauderdale that's flying seaplanes. They're flying caravans on floats. I had a chance to fly along with them out to St. Martin from Fort Lauderdale a number of years ago for a story at Flying. And it was just, I went, whoa, this is so cool. If I was single, I mean, they were looking for pilots. And I said, oh man, Rob, if I was single, I'd be down here in a heartbeat to do this. Because I thought, man, just flying across the Caribbean where the weather's usually gorgeous and seeing all these tropical isles. And it looked like a great, great life. But people that are holed up, simply filling out airline applications may never even consider anything like any of these things that we're talking about. And I think they're missing an opportunity to not just build some hours, but really have some fun flying experiences.
Totally. Let's go ahead and switch gears now and talk about banner towing. I know you've done that in the past. Tell us what that was like and what the opportunities are for people to get into banner towing as a way to build flight hours.
Banner towing. Well, it's another job that I ran into simply by being an airport bum, because when I didn't find enough to do at our airport at Palwaukee, I would drive up the road to another place, Chicagoland, which is long since gone, but it was the home of the Northbrook VOR for people that want to know where it was geographically. But it was a small airport. I think the hard surface runway, it had only one, was about 2,500 feet long. But that meant that all you saw were little airplanes there. And I think I may have mentioned that I bought an airplane of my own years earlier. I had bought a Champ and flew it around a lot. And so whenever I saw one of those on the ground somewhere, I was always wandering around, snooping and just saying, ooh, I remember this. Yes. And I happened to be doing that at this airport one day, and this guy came up and he said, can I help you? And I said, oh, no. I said, I'm sorry. I'm just snooping inside your airplane. I used to have one kind of like this, except it was the smaller horsepower. And he said, oh, yeah, tell me about it. And we started chatting. And I said, so what do you do with this thing anyway? He said, I tow banners, and it's also a night sign. Now, I don't even know if night signs still exist. Imagine a tail dragger airplane, but imagine from one wingtip to another, there's like a wire mesh running from one wingtip under the wing, kind of underneath the belly, and then up the other side to the other wingtip. And inside, embedded in that wire mesh, were little lights. And inside the cockpit, there was a system that, depending on what the message was, would fire the lights in sequence. And it looked just like the marquee on an old movie theater, coming this week, and you'd see the letters slide. And so I said, wow, that must be way cool. And he said, yeah, you want to go fly the airplane? And I went, sure. People were always offering me their airplane to go fly. I must have had this really trustworthy face, or else the kid in the candy store kind of look with his nose on the glass. But and so he let me fly, and he said, "So you want to try some landings?" I said, "Sure." I mean, I felt very comfortable in a similar tail dragger, and I guess I did some decent landings, and we taxied back in, and he said, wow, so that's, hey, stay in touch. We often look for people to, that we're looking for to fly the airplane. And I said, oh, okay. And I never even asked him what he paid. It didn't even cross my mind. And a couple of months later, he called me and he said, hey, I wonder if you'd be interested in working for us on the weekends. And I said, oh, running that crazy sign that you have under your airplane? He said, well, that plus we tow banners. And I knew nothing about that because when I saw his airplane, I didn't know he was a banner tower. And I said, I don't know anything about that. He said, well, we're towing tomorrow at a field not far away from where I lived. And he said, come on out about 11 o'clock and I'll show you. You can watch what we do. And so I drove over there and I watched these two guys stand at the end of a field. Each had a big, tall pole, maybe 10 feet tall, and they were on opposite sides of this field with a big long rope kind of draped between them. It looked like a clothesline in somebody's backyard back years ago when people didn't have gas dryers to dry their clothing with. But he said, "Okay, when I'm," and he had a portable radio and was talking to 72, and he said, "Now watch this." And I watched. I said, "Oh, there's the champ," and he's on a left base, and he said, he's coming in here. And I said, so he's going to land? Oh, no, he's not going to land. Watch this. Because what he's going to do is he's going to drop this hook that's on a rope out the back of the airplane, and it's going to dangle back there as he gets close to this. And then as he gets down close to the ground, he's going to level off for about 15 or 20 feet. And then that hook is going to grab that rope in between the poles, and then he's going to fly off, and he's got a banner, and it's an advertising banner for some product or whatever. And I watched this guy. I swear I thought the guy was looking like he was going to flare for landing, and then he poured the coals to it, and he was flying along maybe 8 feet above the ground, and he's just going full power. I mean, and it looked like an incredible buzz job, except that, of course, the field was all empty, and the hook grabbed that banner, and it's like he pulled back on the stick to make a rapid climb, and it took the banner away from the ground, and he started climbing out. But of course, that banner is a huge chunk of drag. It's like taking off with full flaps, I think, maybe 172 or something, because it really changes the flight characteristics of the airplane. I learned this later on when they trained me in the airplane. And so eventually I did get hired, and I flew on the weekends around the Chicago lakefront. At the time, we could fly around the ballpark. So I would tow a banner sometimes around Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs, where they are the World Series winners from, 10 years ago or something like that. And then also we could fly around Northwestern Stadium for the football games, down at Soldier Field for the Bears games. And at the time, Chicago Megs was open, and very often I would fly a banner around Soldier Field in the late afternoon, and then go back up north to the empty field and fly over and drop the banner. And then I would go back southeast and I'd land at Megs and sit there for a couple hours till it got dark. And then I would do a couple of night signs over some of the field, like maybe the Bears were playing late that day. So as it got dark, they could see a night sign, and they would continue the advertising game. So I was early into advertising even before I knew I was an advertising exec. Well, maybe not an exec, but I was certainly in the operation. But again, it was great experience, especially when you learned that not only it was fun. I mean, there's no doubt about that, but you really had to be on your toes as a pilot, because again, with the banner, there was an incredible amount of drag. You were always worried if the engine so much as coughed, you had to grab that lever and drop that banner quickly, or you would just come straight down. With the night sign, of course, all that chicken wire and all the lights were also a lot of drag, and so you had to be prepared for that. In landing, you'd landed a little differently with the drag. In fact, one time I wrote a story about flying back from Megs in weather that I did not at the time realize, because I was young and stupid, but it was starting to turn. The rain was starting to turn into freezing rain, And by the time I landed, there were icicles hanging from the wires underneath the fuselage. And I pulled up to the ramp to get the airplane gassed up, and the guys on the ramp were like, "Holy smokes, look at this thing." And I got out and I thought, oh my Lord, it looked like little icicles hanging from the bottom of the airplane. And I thought, oh my God. So that really burned a respect for ice into my brain. And of course, it was, I didn't get hurt or anything. But so again, everybody doesn't learn the intricacies of flying by reading a book and flying a jet. There are all kinds of places in between where you'll learn many, many different aspects of flying and operating an aircraft that are very practical and things that you can use later in your life. So these days, there are still many banner towers around. We have a couple of them here in Chicago that go up and down the lakefront. Of course, they can't tow around some of these events anymore because there's a TFR that's up around all these places after 9/11. And there's some down in Florida. There are some on the East Coast, some on the West Coast, usually where there's a big body of water that people will hang out in or hang out at to, have a good time and lay on the beach or whatever. And the one thing I learned with banner towing is that you have to be going the right direction, because if you fly the banner along the coast and you're flying the wrong direction, the people can't read it because it's backwards to them. And I learned that one time after I flew an hour around the lake when I first started, and I landed and they called me and they said, "You've got to fly. You can only fly this way, not that way," because the banner was backwards and nobody could read it. And I went, oh. Well, anyway, they didn't fire me or anything, but I learned that too, and all kinds of all this practical knowledge that you learn, and but it was still fun, and there are still people that are out there doing it, and you just have to seek them out.
Now, one thing I've noticed about banner tow operations is most of the time I see tailwheel planes involved. I've occasionally read about 150s or 152s being used, and I watched a banner tow operation at Oakland Airport before 9/11, so when they were towing them around the ballparks. And I think they used a Stearman, as I recall. And it was just fascinating to see them dive down for the banner and use what looked like a grappling hook, something that you might see in a spy movie, for climbing the walls of the building. And they would just throw that out the back and hook the banner. Is that your observation too on tail wheels? Is that something where if someone wants to do this, they better get their tail wheel endorsement if they're looking to tow banners?
I would say it's really going to help. Most of the banner towing operations that I saw, as well as the ones I was involved with, were operated with tail wheel airplanes. I wish I could say I knew exactly why. We did tow in a Cessna 150 one season that had a 150 horse engine in it. So as a 150 with nothing attached, boy, that 150 really smoked. It really did. But you needed that 150 horse to climb away once you had that banner in tow. And because, again, it's a lot of drag. But again, most of the time, I've seen Champs, I've seen Stearmans, I've seen people tow with Grumman Agcats, which are, again, all tail draggers. I don't know, maybe somebody that's much more knowledgeable about banner towing can explain why they tend to be tail draggers. But I would say that if you have no tail dragger time, you probably aren't going to get employed as a banner tow pilot.
Great. All right, let's move on and talk about time building programs. Now, unfortunately, these are not ways to build hours where you get paid, but where you end up paying money. But they sometimes structure them so that the cost is relatively low. So if you're anxious to get your 1,500 hours and you've got the money, you can look into some of these. Often they use low-cost aircraft, which you would kind of expect. Some of these programs use single-engine aircraft. Some of them use twins if you're looking to build up your multi-engine time. Often they will pair you with another pilot so that you can split the cost. Now, you should note that you can't both be logging the time at the same time, except for one situation, and that is that if there's an agreement ahead of time that one of the pilots, for example, the one that's going to operate as a safety pilot, agrees to be the PIC, then the other pilot can be under the hood and logging PIC time. And that's slightly different from being the PIC. But usually, I think most airlines are not going to be too concerned about whether you were the PIC or whether you logged PIC time. So that's the one way that you can split the cost in half if you've got two pilots on board. Some of these places will have a fixed price for number of hours. So, for example, you can buy 100 hours of time. When you're looking at that, you really ought to take a look at the rates. Is that rate for the wet airplane includes fuel, or is that a dry rate where you're still going to have to pay for fuel on top of that? What kind of avionics do they have in the aircraft? If it's an older plane, it's less expensive, but it may have really poor avionics in it. You might also take a look at where you're going to sleep. Some of these programs will provide housing. In other cases, you've got to provide the hotel and pay for that as well. So you want to shop very carefully if you're looking at time building programs. So, Rob, anything you'd like to add to that?
I never took advantage of any of these kinds of programs, so I don't have any direct experience with them. But my common sense tells me that if you are involved in any kind of operation where you are trying to build time and you're paying someone for that privilege of flying their airplane, you really want to make sure that you've taken the time to take a close look at the aircraft's maintenance history and the reputation of the organization that you might be flying with. But also, just as my own kind of guide, I would never be paying a huge chunk of money up front to any company to get work done. Because let's say that they say, well, we sell our time in 50-hour blocks, and it's only $100 an hour to you. And so if you just give us $5,000, you'll be in the program, and you just run that off. And when your 50 hours is up, we'll ask you for more. And well, yeah, but what if that company goes broke when you've only burned out 21 hours of your time? We've seen that happen. There was a helicopter operation out there in the Southwest that this happened to, and people are just left. Company goes bankrupt. You show up at the airport and the doors are locked, and there's a sign on the window that said we're permanently closed or something, and you could lose all your money. So if there were an opportunity to do this, I would do it, but I would make certain that I was protecting my investment as well, and perhaps charging it on a credit card that you can get, in smaller chunks that you could possibly get reimbursed by the card company if this organization went bankrupt. And again, it's just me. It's probably speaking to my paranoia about these kinds of programs. And I'm not saying that they're all bad or anything like that, but I'm just saying, just be a good consumer and protect yourself.
Yep, that totally makes sense. And I guess along with the formal time building programs where you would go to someone else who has the airplanes, you could always do your own personal time building program where if you've got the money, you might either rent an airplane or buy an airplane. I know of one person who actually did their 1,500 hours within a year just with the family airplane, flying it around the country. So that's one way if you've got the money to be able to do that.
Sure. And I had an airplane that I didn't pay an awful lot of money for. It was a simple airplane. When it broke, it wasn't thousands and thousands of dollars to fix. It was a couple hundred. Maybe the spring on the tail wheel popped, or there was a hole in the fabric, or you can still buy an airplane for $15,000, $20,000. It's not going to be a Cirrus. It's not going to be a new 182 that you're going to fly. But you could fly an older Cessna 140 or an older Piper Cherokee or something like that that still has a lot of good life in the motor. And all you want to do is just go gather some cross-country time. Take 2 days a week and just plan a flight and make it a few hundred miles, make a day of it. And rather than just boring holes in the sky, doing touch and goes at your local airport. Because when you do have a job interview and they look at your logbook, the fact that you made the effort to fly somewhere else, track to different airports, use different equipment, perhaps shoot some approaches if you were so rated, rather than just flying a 150 in the pattern, they're going to look at that differently than they will, again, just boring holes in the sky.
Yeah, I guess another variation of this would be the leases. Unfortunately, I don't know of a good way to find out what aircraft are available where the owners want to lease them out. Most of the ones I've heard have been informal kinds of things where somebody is not using their airplane as much as they'd like, and so they offer it for a lease at an attractive rate. So that's another way that you might find a way to get an airplane that you could use for building time. We're going to have someone on, I believe, later on to talk a little bit about glider tow. Neither you nor I have any glider tow experience, but that is another way that people can build time is as a glider tow pilot. And again, I think that's something that you can do with relatively low hours. You don't have to have 1,000 hours, I don't think, to get a job doing that. But of course, you've got to have a glider operation somewhere nearby that's close for you to get to. And if there is one, you probably know about it, or you can go ahead and search to find out one. And then I would say just go on out there and watch the operation and talk to people, and you may find an opportunity to do that.
Absolutely.
So to wrap up, let's talk about the one that you and I have probably done the most of, which is flight instruction. And my guess is that for people that are looking to build time to go to the airlines, probably more people do flight instruction than any of the other jobs that we've talked to. On the other hand, there's some people that just aren't interested in doing flight instruction. And for them, they have all these other opportunities that we've just talked about. And in fact, I would encourage someone who's looking to build time and not particularly interested in flight instruction to not become a flight instructor, because frankly, we want folks that are interested in doing it. We want people that are excited about it and are, putting their heart and soul in it, so that they're really diligent about training their clients to be the best possible pilots. We don't really want to find people in the industry who are doing it half-heartedly. They're just paying their dues until they can get the job that they really should have, which is being an airline pilot. You're not going to be giving as good instruction. Your clients are going to suffer. And frankly, I think sometimes when we read about accidents where pilots have gone off and done stuff that just seems crazy, you have to think that maybe they weren't given good guidance as they were getting their private. That gosh, when you've got 100 hours, it really doesn't make sense to take off and fly at night over the mountains when there's weather, or any of these other kinds of things that we see. But what are your thoughts about flight instruction as a way to build time?
I think flight instruction to build time, I don't particularly care for the operation. I'm not a big booster on, if you want to build time, go get a flight instructor certificate, because I often find from the instructors that I speak to, it doesn't work out well because they have the wrong motivation. You need to understand that as a flight instructor, you're there to teach. You're not there to fly the airplane necessarily. And when people only want to build time, they tend to be very nonchalant about many things. And there's the law of primacy that we all learned about years ago that said that the first 6, 8, 10 hours of flying time really help determine how you feel about the learning experience. And if you have an instructor that is not really into teaching people about flying, but really just goes up because they want to sit in the right seat and log time, and I think it can really do a disservice to you, the client, if you're a brand new student pilot, and you're not doing the industry any good either, because once those people are licensed, eventually they're going to be out there in the airspace that you're in too. And I would rather not be in the airspace. IFR was someone that is kind of, I can kind of handle it. I'm really cool. I can do everything, and because my instructor said I was great at this and whatever. And so again, as a time builder, I'm just not a real booster of flight instruction for that.
Yeah, and along those lines, I would encourage anyone who flies to always put their heart and soul into it and to try and be the best darn pilot at whatever it is they happen to fly. And don't ever look at any of these jobs as just something like, it's a way for me to make money, or it's a way for me to get time. It's a learning experience. You want to put your heart and soul in it, and you want to be the best darn pilot that ever existed in that particular job. So don't look at it as a 9 to 5. Live, breathe the experience, and in your spare time, be studying and learning about more things that you can be doing in that area. Well, we've covered a lot of different ways to build flight time here. There's one other way that we should just mention in brief. I don't necessarily recommend it, but Rob, do you remember what it is to log P51 time?
Oh, you're going to make me answer that. Years ago, there's a company called Parker Pen. You can find them on the internet. They make every kind of pen imaginable, from ballpoints to the old ink cartridge with scrolling tips. But anyway, in the old days, there was a particular Parker pen that was the P51. And I mean, I don't think the people at Parker created it because they were airplane geeks. I think they just happened to think it was a cool model number for their particular pen. And so what it came to indicate was that people would go into their logbooks and add time that was bogus. I mean, they really didn't fly the Cessna 421 for 807 hours and, multi-engine. They were making it up. They were lying, which is, of course, a federal offense. But the other thing was that sometimes the people that were adding P51 time to their logbooks were like a lot of criminals. Sometimes they're not real smart, and people would add time, add jet time, and they had no type rating, and they'd say they gained 250 hours of right seat time in a citation in 2 months or something, and you would have had to have been living and breathing in the airplane in order to accomplish that. Or they flew cross country in places that were nigh on to impossible to get to. And so it was a big joke in the industry that if you had a lot of time in a specific airplane, sometimes in an interview they'd say, so is this true, or is this P51 time? And for the longest time, I didn't even know what they were talking about. And I asked the guy, I said, I don't have any P51 time. I've never even been in a warbird. He said, warbird? No, we're not talking about warbird. I thought North American P51 Mustang. And the guy said, no, kid, are you crazy? I mean the people that are making bogus entries on their logbook. And honestly, I was so naive, I didn't even realize that was a possibility, or that anybody would do something like that. But I guess it takes all kinds of people. But now I'm sure in your experience, you were a lot smarter than I was, because you're an engineer. And so I'm sure you knew what P51 time was long before I did, didn't you?
I'm sure that I had exactly the same confusion the first time that I heard about it or read about it. And of course, we're just talking about this really jokingly. We do not recommend that you do that. It's a really bad practice. Not only that, if that's the kind of thing that you would consider doing, you really don't belong in aviation. And the reason I say that is
because you're going to take other chances.
Yeah, exactly. We have a lot of rules, and we try to follow all of them all the time, because all of those rules are written in blood, which means that someone died, and so they created a new rule. And if you're willing to cheat on something like this, you're probably willing to cheat on the FARs, and now you've become a significant risk to the industry. And if you think, oh, that's not so, all you have to look at is a study that the NTSB did, in which they showed that 30% of all fatal accidents involved some type of violation of the FARs. It might be somebody who hadn't done their flight review in the last 2 years, or someone who was no longer instrument current or didn't have their medical. But again, if you would even consider doing that, We don't want you in the industry.
No, and to be honest, though, there is 91.3, which is the PIC regulation, which says in an emergency, you as the pilot in command may deviate from any regulation in any part in order to safely get the airplane down on the ground. That's different. Now, and when that happens, you're probably going to interact with somebody from the FSDO who's going to say, tell me about why you did this particular action, why you took this particular action, and why you violated the airspeed reg or the altitude regulation or the weight reg or whatever. And if you have an emergency situation you needed to do this for, you're going to be fine. But as long as you don't have a lot of emergencies in your career. But otherwise, no. And you said this to me years ago when we first met, is that the best way to stay alive is to not violate the regs. Just follow the damn rules. I mean, and 180 pounds overweight is overweight. Don't fly overweight, and you won't get yourself into a situation. But again, that's something you and I have learned, luckily, without hurting ourselves.
Well, that's a good way to get to be an old pilot as well, is by following the rules. A lot of people don't make it all the way to the end of a career because they've had an accident. Rob, this has been great fun. Thanks so much for sharing all your experience and all the different ways that one can build time. Tell us where people can go to find out more about you and what you do.
Oh, they're going to find me anywhere that has Jetwine in the title. Jetwine.com, of course, is where Scott Spangler and I hang out on the internet. And if you haven't read Scott's work, we're both journalists. And so we have some way cool stories that we tell up there, but also in the pages of various and sundry magazines.
Great. Always fun to have you here. Thanks so much, Rob.
You betcha. Let's do it again.
And I want to mention one other resource for pilots who are looking for low-time pilot jobs. I mentioned the Road to 1500 website where you can learn about a lot of these jobs. And just a couple of weeks ago, Ivan Riberison, who runs that website, began offering what he calls the Ultimate Low-Time Pilot Jobs Database, which he sells for $29.99. I haven't seen it, but apparently it includes minimum hour requirements to apply, location, website, contact information, and in some cases, information about pay, work schedules, and more. So it sounds like a fairly efficient way to help find these jobs. To get to that website, just Google The Road to 1500. And of course, I will also include a link for it in the show notes. And my thanks to Rob Mark for joining us here today. You can find more of his work at jetwine.com. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/support to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You